To understand the heartbeat of the American South in the 1930s, we have to look past the dusty roads of Alabama and into the quiet, complex moral landscape of a small town called Macomb. Macomb isn't just a setting, it is a character in itself, suffering from a tired kind of heat, where the days were long and the red, move-in ready clay stuck to everything. It was a time of the Great Depression, where people moved slowly because there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. This is the world of Scout Finch, a young girl whose eyes provide the lens through which we witness the slow, painful loss of innocence. Scout lives with her brother Jem and their father Atticus, a man whose integrity serves as the steady North Star in a town that is often lost in its own prejudices. The story begins not with a trial, but with the curiosity of children, a curiosity that leads them toward the mystery of the Radley place and its most famous inhabitant, Boo Radley. Boo is the local bogeyman, a phantom who hasn't been seen in years, and to the children, he represents the ultimate unknown. They spend their summers trying to make him come out, turning his isolation into a game of dare and imagination. But Atticus, with his quiet wisdom, tries to teach them a different lesson. He tells them that you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. This simple piece of advice is the philosophical anchor of the entire narrative. It is a call for radical empathy in a world that is built on rigid social boundaries. At this stage, the mockingbird is just a metaphor, a bird that does nothing but make music for us to enjoy. To kill one is a sin because it is a harmless, innocent creature. As the children grow, they begin to realize that the world is full of mockingbirds, people who are innocent, yet vulnerable to the cruelty of others. The atmosphere of Macomb is one of stagnant tradition. Everyone knows everyone's business, and the old families are ranked by how long they have lived on the same patch of land. This social hierarchy is a source of comfort for some, but it is a cage for others. Scout, with her overalls and her penchant for fistfights, is a constant challenge to the expectations of Southern ladyhood. Her aunt, Alexandra, represents the rigid old guard, constantly trying to prune Scout's personality into something more acceptable. But Atticus allows his children to be themselves, encouraging them to ask questions and think for themselves. This creates a fascinating tension within the Finch household. They are part of the town, yet they are fundamentally different from it. They are in the world, but not entirely of it. This sense of being an insider-outsider is what allows Scout and Jem to see the cracks in the town's facade long before their peers do. As the summer of 1933 fades into 1934, the games involving Boo Radley become more intense. The children find small treasures in a knothole of an old oak tree. Chewing gum, Indian head pennies, a tarnished medal. These are the first signals that the monster they fear is actually reaching out to them. It is a subtle shift from fear to connection, but it is interrupted by the harsh reality of the adult world. When the knothole is filled with cement by Nathan Radley, Jem is moved to tears. It is his first real brush with the idea that the world can be unnecessarily cruel to those who are trying to be kind. This moment marks the end of their early childhood, and the beginning of a more somber realization that the phantoms we fear are often just lonely people, and the real monsters are the ones we live next to every day. Continuing into the deepening layers of Macomb's moral struggle, we see the arrival of a conflict that will change the town forever. Atticus Finch is appointed to defend Tom Robinson, a black man accused of a terrible crime against a white woman. In the racial climate of the 1930s, this is more than just a legal case. It is an act of social defiance. The town's usual malady, prejudice, begins to flare up, and the children find themselves at the centre of the storm. They hear words they don't fully understand and face taunts from their neighbours and classmates. Atticus explains to them that he had to take the case to keep his head up and under town, to represent this county in the legislature, and to be able to tell his children what to do. He knows he cannot win, but he believes that the courage to fight even when you know you are licked from the start is the only way to preserve one's soul. The trial of Tom Robinson is the fulcrum upon which the story turns. It is the moment where the innocence of childhood meets the calculated injustice of the legal system. Scout and Jem watch from the coloured balcony, a vantage point that physically separates them from the white citizens below and symbolically aligns them with the marginalised. They watch as Atticus methodically deconstructs the prosecution's case. He proves through logic and physical evidence that Tom could not have committed the crime. The truth is laid bare. The real crime was the breaking of a social code by Mayella Ewell, a woman trapped in her own poverty and loneliness, who lashed out to protect her own fragile reputation. But in Maycomb, the truth is often less powerful than the white man's word. During the trial, the concept of the Mockingbird takes on its most tragic form. Tom Robinson is an innocent man whose only sin was helping a woman who was lonelier than he was. By accusing him, the Ewells are trying to kill a mockingbird. The jury's verdict, guilty, is a gut punch to Jem. He had believed in the ultimate fairness of the law, but he discovers that the law is only as fair as the people who sit in the jury box. He sees that man's inhumanity to man is not an abstraction. It is a lived reality that has the power to destroy lives. This is the moment where Jem's childhood officially ends. He stops seeing Maycomb as a place of safety and starts seeing it as a place of hypocrisy. He realizes that the people he thought were his friends are capable of profound cruelty when their social standing is threatened. In the aftermath of the trial, the danger shifts from the courtroom to the streets. Bob Ewell, humiliated by the way Atticus exposed his lies, vows revenge. He doesn't go after Atticus directly, he goes after the children. This leads to the climax of the story, a night of terror under the shadows of the trees during the 1935 Halloween pageant. In the darkness, the children are attacked, and in the ensuing struggle, a mysterious figure intervenes to save them. That figure is Boo Radley. The phantom they had spent years trying to draw out finally emerges, not as a monster, but as a protector. When Scout finally stands on the Radley porch and looks out at the neighbourhood from Boo's perspective, she realises that he had been watching them all along, not with malice, but with a strange, quiet affection. He was a mockingbird who had been hurt by the world, but who still chose to do a final heroic act of kindness. As the dust settles from the trial of Tom Robinson, we find ourselves navigating the heavy atmosphere of a town that has successfully protected its status quo at the cost of its soul. The verdict of guilty, delivered in the sweltering heat of 1935, acts as a poison in the veins of the Finch children, particularly Jem. While Scout is still young enough to be cushioned by her curiosity, Jem has reached an age where the discrepancy between the law and justice is a jagged pill he cannot swallow. He begins to see that the fine folks of Maycomb are held together by a fragile web of mutual agreement to ignore the truth when it becomes inconvenient. Atticus, ever the teacher, doesn't try to sugarcoat the reality for his son. He explains that in our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. It is ugly, it is wrong, but it is the reality of the world they inhabit. This realization brings us to the deeper philosophical question of what it means to live in a polite society that is built on a foundation of exclusion. Atticus tells Jem that as you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that white man is trash. This is a revolutionary statement in the context of the 1930s South. It strips away the armour of social class and family heritage that people like Aunt Alexandra used to justify their sense of superiority. It suggests that true class is not found in your bloodline or your bank account, but in the way you treat those who have no power over you. The children also begin to grapple with the different kinds of folks in the world. Jem, in his burgeoning cynicism, tries to categorise everyone into 4 groups: the ordinary folks like them and the neighbours, the folks like the Cunninghams out in the woods, the folks like the Ewells down at the dump, and the black community. He thinks that maybe the reason Boo Radley stayed shut up in the house all these years is simply because he wanted to stay inside. Jem is starting to understand that the world outside is a place where people go out of their way to hurt each other, and perhaps the isolation of the Radley house isn't a prison, but a sanctuary. This shift in perspective from seeing Boo as a monster to seeing him as a fellow victim of the world's cruelty is a major milestone in Jem's moral development. Meanwhile, Scout is forced to navigate the missionary circle, a gathering of the town's most prominent women who meet to discuss helping the underprivileged in Africa, while simultaneously expressing disdain for the black citizens in their own backyard. This is where Harper Lee's critique of hypocrisy reaches its peak. Scout watches as these women use religion as a shield for their prejudice, speaking of Christian forgiveness in one breath and complaining about their servants in the next. Through Scout's innocent eyes, we see the absurdity of their world. She realizes that she feels more comfortable in the world of her father, a world of logic, grit and hard truths, than in the perfumed world of southern ladies, where what you say is rarely what you mean. The narrative now shifts toward the mounting tension following the trial, a period defined by the lingering shadow of Bob Ewell's resentment. Despite winning the case, Ewell finds himself even more of an outcast than before. He has been exposed as a liar and a child abuser in a public forum, and he knows that the town only sided with him because they had no other choice to maintain their racial hierarchy. He begins a campaign of petty, cowardly harassment, targeting those connected to the case. He follows Helen Robinson, he tries to break into Judge Taylor's house, and eventually he sets his sights on the Finch children. This escalating threat serves as a reminder that prejudice and ignorance do not go away just because a trial is over. They often mutate into something even more dangerous. As we approach the night of the Halloween pageant in 1935, the atmosphere is thick with a sense of impending doom. Scout, dressed as a ham in a restrictive wire and fabric costume, provides a touch of humour that underscores the tragedy to come. On their walk home through the pitch-black woods, she and Jem are stalked by an unseen figure. The attack is sudden and brutal. Jem's arm is broken and Scout is trapped within her costume, unable to see but feeling the violence erupting around her. It is in this moment of absolute darkness that the Phantom finally reveals his true nature. A man emerges from the shadows to pull the attacker off the children and carry the unconscious Jem home. When the doctor and the sheriff arrive, the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Bob Ewell is found dead under a tree with a kitchen knife under his ribs. But the real focus is on the man sitting in the corner of Jem's room, a pale, thin man with sand-coloured hair and eyes so colourless they seem to have never seen the sun. Scout looks at him and realises, with a surge of recognition that transcends words, that it is Boo Radley. "Will you take me home?" he asks in a voice that is little more than a whisper. The monster of her childhood has become the saviour of her life. This is the ultimate subversion of the Southern Gothic trope. The ghost is the only one who is truly human in a world that has gone mad. The final conversation between Atticus and Sheriff Heck Tate is a profound meditation on the nature of justice versus the letter of the law. Tate realises that Boo Radley killed Ewell to save the children, but he insists that they report Ewell fell on his own knife. He knows that bringing Boo into the spotlight of a trial, even for a heroic act, would be like killing a mockingbird. Boo is a man who cannot survive the glare of our public attention. His shyness is his protection. When Atticus asks Scout if she understands, she replies, "Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it?" At last the metaphor is complete. The children have learned that there are some people so innocent, so fragile, that the world must go out of its way to protect them from the very system that claims to seek justice. As Scout walks Boo home and looks out from his porch, she finally sees the neighbourhood through his eyes, realising that he had been their neighbour all along, watching over them in his own quiet way. As we stand on the threshold of Scout's deeper realisation, we must consider the profound internal shift that occurs when a child stops seeing their father as a mere authority figure and starts seeing him as a man of quiet, heroic restraint. In the summer of 1935, the heat in Macomb was not just physical. It was a moral weight that seemed to press down on every household. Scout and Jem began to notice that the town's perception of Atticus had changed. He was no longer just the town lawyer, he was the man who had dared to hold a mirror up to Macomb's conscience. This section of the journey explores the concept of courage as Atticus defines it, not as a man with a gun in his hand, but as someone who knows he is licked before he begins, but sees it through no matter what. This is the courage required to defend Tom Robinson in a court where the verdict was written long before the first witness was called. The children's education in empathy continues through their interactions with Mrs. Henry Lafayette DuBose, the elderly, cantankerous neighbour who spent her days hurling insults at the children from her porch. When Jem, in a fit of rage, destroys her camellias, Atticus forces him to read to her every day for a month. It is only after her death that the children learn the truth. She was a morphine addict who had vowed to break her habit before she died. She wanted to leave the world beholden to nothing and no one. Atticus explains to Jem that Mrs. DuBose was the bravest person he ever knew. This revelation serves as a bridge for the children, teaching them that human beings are rarely as simple as they appear on the surface. Just as Boo Radley was not a monster, Mrs. DuBose was not merely a mean-spirited old woman. She was a fighter in a private, agonizing war of the spirit. This leads us to the broader social critique of Macomb's caste system. a structure that Aunt Alexandra is determined to reinforce. She believes that fine folks are those who have lived on the same plot of land for generations, a definition that conveniently includes the Finches but excludes the hard-working Cunninghams or the trashy Yules. Scout, with her youthful logic, finds this absurd. She sees that the Cunninghams, despite their poverty, have a pride and a dignity that the Yules lack. Atticus reinforces this by teaching Scout that everyone deserves respect until they forfeit it through their own actions, not their birthright. This clash between the Old South values of Aunt Alexandra and the humanistic values of Atticus creates a domestic tension that mirrors the larger conflict brewing in the town square. As the trial draws closer, the children's world begins to shrink. The freedom they once felt in the streets of Maycomb is replaced by a sense of being watched and judged. They learn that in a town like Maycomb, the truth is a dangerous commodity. Even their visit to Calpurnia's church, first purchase, becomes an eye-opening experience in the reality of segregation and the resilience of the black community. For the first time, Scout and Jem see Calpurnia not just as their cook, but as a woman with a life, a language, and a history that exists entirely separate from the Finch household. This encounter deepens their understanding of the Mockingbird theme. They realize that the community Atticus is fighting for is one built on a quiet, shared dignity that the rest of Maycomb is determined to ignore. The transition from the private world of the Finch household to the public spectacle of the trial marks the point of no return for Scout and Jem's innocence. The courthouse in 1935 becomes the stage for a drama that is as much about the town's history as it is about Tom Robinson's future. We see the townspeople gathering like they're attending a picnic, oblivious to the fact that a man's life is hanging in the balance. This picnic atmosphere highlights the terrifying banality of evil in Maycomb, the way prejudice is baked into the everyday lives of good people. Scout and Jem, sitting in the balcony, have a bird's-eye view of the mechanics of injustice. They watch as the Yules take the stand, representing the very worst of Maycomb's white population, yet knowing they hold the ultimate power because of the colour of their skin. The testimony of Mayella Yule is a masterclass in the complexity of human suffering and malice. Scout observes that Maysella must be the loneliest person in the world, even lonelier than Boo Radley. She has no friends, no education, and an abusive father who is the source of her misery. Yet when confronted with the truth of her own loneliness, she chooses to lash out at the one person who showed her kindness. This is the tragedy of the Mockingbird in reverse. The victim becomes the victimizer to survive. Atticus's cross-examination is not an act of cruelty, but a desperate search for the truth in a room full of lies. He shows the jury that Tom Robinson, with his useless left arm, could not have inflicted the injuries Mayella sustained, while Bob Ewell, being left-handed, was the obvious culprit. When Tom Robinson finally takes the stand, the sheer decency of his character stands in stark contrast to the vitriol of his accusers. He tells the truth simply and without malice, admitting that he helped Mayella because he felt sorry for her. This admission, that a black man could feel pity for a white woman, is the moment the trial is truly lost. In the eyes of Maycomb's white citizens, this is an unforgivable breach of the social order. Scout notices the shift in the room. The air becomes thick with a hostility that no amount of logic can dispel. She realizes that the jury isn't listening to the evidence. They are listening to the voices of their ancestors, voices that tell them that their own status depends on Tom's guilt. The final summation by Atticus is perhaps the most famous speech in American literature, a plea for the majesty of the law to transcend the prejudice of the heart. He calls upon the jury to do their duty, reminding them that in a court of law all men are created equal. But as the jury files out, the silence that falls over the courtroom is not one of contemplation, but of a foregone conclusion. Scout and Jem wait for hours, hopeful that the truth will prevail, but when the verdict is finally read, it is a hammer blow. The guilty verdict is his sin against the very principles the town claims to uphold. As Atticus walks out of the courtroom, the black community in the balcony stands in a silent, powerful show of respect. They recognize that while the trial was a failure of justice, it was a triumph of human integrity. As the heavy silence of the verdict settled over the town of Maycomb in the late summer of 1935, the aftermath of the trial began to ripple through the private lives of those who had witnessed the collapse of justice. For the children, the world had fundamentally shifted its axis. The comfortable, predictable rhythms of their childhood were replaced by a sombre awareness of usual malady that infected their neighbours. Atticus, though weary, remained the steadfast pillar of the household, receiving a flood of food and gratitude from the black community the morning after the trial. This gesture was a silent acknowledgement that while the law had failed, a moral victory had been won in the arena of human conscience. Scout watched as her father navigated the town's tension with a quiet, almost detached grace, even when confronted by the vitriol of those who felt threatened by his defense of the truth. The town was breathing a collective sigh of relief that the status quo had been preserved. Yet beneath the surface, a dangerous resentment was brewing in the heart of Bob Ewell. The narrative now expands to explore the long, simmering autumn that followed the trial, a season characterized by a peculiar kind of waiting. Jem, in particular, struggled with a profound sense of disillusionment that made him question the very foundation of civilization. He spent hours discussing the nature of the caste system with Atticus, trying to reconcile the idea of fine folks with the reality of the jury's decision. He began to see that the social layers of Maycomb, the Finches, the Cunninghams, the Ewells, and the black community, were not just economic groupings, but moral categories defined by their willingness to acknowledge the humanity of others. Atticus explained that the jury system, while flawed, was the only thing that stood between a man and a lynch mob, yet he admitted that when prejudice enters the jury box, the law becomes a tool of the powerful. This period of reflection served as a bridge for Jem, moving him from the simple certainties of boyhood toward the complex, often painful responsibilities of adulthood. Scout, meanwhile, found herself thrust into the world of southern marmotal womanhood through Aunt Alexandra's missionary circle meetings. In these gatherings, she witnessed the peak of Maycomb's hypocrisy, women who wept for the plight of the marooners in Africa, while expressing utter contempt for the sulky black servants in their own kitchens. Scout's observations here provide a sharp, ironic contrast to the quiet dignity of Calpurnia, who remained the steady heart of the Finch kitchen. Through Scout's eyes, we see the absurdity of a moral code that values appearance over substance and family heritage over individual integrity. When news arrived during one of these meetings that Tom Robinson had been shot 17 times while attempting to escape from prison, the perfumed world of the ladies was momentarily shattered by the raw, brutal reality of the world they helped create. The death of Tom Robinson serves as the final tragic proof of the Mockingbird metaphor. Mr. Underwood, the town's newspaper editor, wrote a scathing editorial comparing Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. He noted that Tom was a dead man the minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth and screamed, because in the court of public opinion, his guilt was an established fact of his birth. This realization hit the children with a new kind of force. They understood now that the trouble was not just a single bad verdict, but a systemic cruelty that claimed lives with the indifference of a machine. As the town moved toward the end of 1935, the sense of a coming storm grew, and the children began to feel that the safety of their home was no longer guaranteed in a world that could so easily dispose of the innocent. The transition into the winter of 1935 and the early months of 1936 brought a false sense of peace to Maycomb, as if the town were trying to forget the trauma of the trial. However, for Bob Ewell, the victory in court had turned into a source of ongoing humiliation. He found that even in winning, he had become a symbol of the town's most shameful elements, and his attempts to reclaim his honour through petty harassment became more frequent. He acquired a job with the WPA, only to lose it within days for laziness, blaming Atticus for his failure. He targeted Judge Taylor, whose house he tried to break into, and followed Helen Robinson, Tom's widow, with menacing whispers as she walked to work. These events were like tremors before an earthquake, warnings that the monsters of the mind were taking physical shape in the shadows of the town. Within the Finch household, the dynamics continued to evolve as the children navigated their new understanding of the world's darkness. Atticus remained the calm centre, teaching them that while Bob Ewell was a threat, he was also a man who had had his day in court and lost the only thing he truly cared about, the town's respect. Jem's growing maturity was evident in his protective attitude towards Scout, an echo of the way Atticus protected the vulnerable in the courtroom. They began to see their father not just as a lawyer, but as a man who lived his philosophy every hour of the day, someone who didn't do anything in the house that he wouldn't do on the street. This consistency was their anchor in a town where people changed their morals as easily as their clothes. The narrative then focuses on the peculiar events leading up to the Halloween pageant of 1936. Because the children of the town had caused mischief the previous year by hiding the furniture of two elderly sisters, the adults decided to organise a structured celebration at the school. Scout was cast as a ham, a role that required her to wear a cumbersome costume made of chicken wire and brown cloth. On the night of the pageant, as they walked through the pitch-black woods toward the school, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of cosmic indifference. The ordinary sounds of the night, the crickets, the wind in the trees, seemed to take on a predatory quality. Scout's costume, which restricted her vision and movement, became a metaphor for the way prejudice blinds and traps the individual within a rigid social identity. The climax of the story occurs on the walk home from the pageant, a moment where the phantoms of the children's imagination and the monsters of the town's reality finally collide. In the absolute darkness of the woods, they were attacked by Bob Ewell in a final desperate act of cowardice. The violence was swift and chaotic. Jem's arm was snapped, and Scout was nearly crushed within her costume. It was in this moment of peak terror that a mysterious figure intervened, pulling Ewell away and carrying the broken Jem toward the safety of the light. This saviour was none other than Boo Radley, the man who had been the subject of their childhood games and fears. The trouble of being born into a world of judgment had forced Boo into a life of service, yet he emerged to perform an act of radical selfless kindness. As Scout eventually realised, sitting in the quiet of Jem's room, the real ghost was the one who'd been watching over them all along, proving that in the end, the only thing that can truly conquer the dark is a quiet, steady humanity. To understand the moral weight of Maycomb in the year 1935, we must look at the way the town began to exhale after the trial, a collective sigh of relief that the status quo had been preserved. This period was defined by a heavy, stagnant atmosphere, where the usual malady of prejudice seemed to settle back into the red clay of Alabama. For Scout and Jem, the world had fundamentally shifted its axis. The comfortable, predictable rhythms of their childhood were replaced by a sombre awareness of the human capacity for cruelty. Atticus, though weary from the emotional toll of the courtroom, remained the steadfast pillar of the household. The morning after the verdict, he was greeted by a flood of food and gratitude from the black community, a silent and powerful acknowledgement that while the law had failed, a moral victory had been won in the arena of human conscience. Scout watched as her father navigated this tension with a quiet, almost detached grace, even when confronted by the vitriol of neighbours who felt threatened by his defence of the truth. The narrative now expands to explore the long, simmering autumn that followed the trial, a season characterised by a peculiar kind of waiting and a deepening of the children's internal dialogue. Jem in particular struggled with a profound sense of disillusionment that made him question the very foundation of civilization and the logic of adulthood. He spent hours discussing the nature of the caste system with Atticus, trying to reconcile the idea of fine folks with the reality of the jury's decision. He began to see that the social layers of Maycomb, the Finches, the Cunninghams, the Ewells, and the black community, were not just economic groupings, but moral categories defined by their willingness to acknowledge the humanity of others. Atticus explained that the jury system, while flawed, was the only thing that stood between a man and a lynch mob. Yet he admitted that when prejudice enters the jury box, the law becomes a tool of the powerful. This period of reflection served as a bridge for Jem, moving him from the simple certainties of boyhood toward the complex, often painful responsibilities of maturity. Scout, meanwhile, found herself thrust into the world of Southern womanhood through Aunt Alexandra's missionary circle meetings. In these gatherings, she witnessed the peak of Maycomb's hypocrisy, women who wept for the plight of the underprivileged in distant lands while expressing utter contempt for the hard-working citizens in their own kitchens. Scout's observations provide a sharp, ironic contrast to the quiet dignity of Calpurnia, who remained the steady heart of the Finch kitchen. Through Scout's eyes, we see the absurdity of a moral code that values appearance over substance and family heritage over individual integrity. When news arrived that Tom Robinson had been shot 17 times while attempting to escape from prison, the perfumed world of the ladies was momentarily shattered by the raw, brutal reality of the world they helped create. This death serves as the final tragic proof of the Mockingbird metaphor. Mr. Underwood, the town's newspaper editor, wrote a scathing editorial comparing Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. He noted that Tom was a dead man the minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth, because in the court of public opinion his guilt was an established fact of his birth. This realization hit the children with a new kind of force. They understood now that the trouble was not just a single bad verdict, but a systemic cruelty that claimed lives with the indifference of a machine. As the town moved toward the end of the year 1935, the sense of a coming storm grew, and the children began to feel that the safety of their home was no longer guaranteed in a world that could so easily dispose of the innocent. The transition into the winter months of the year 1935 and the early part of 1936 brought a false sense of peace to Maycomb, as if the town were trying to forget the trauma of the trial. However, for Bob Ewell, the victory in the court had turned into a source of ongoing humiliation. He found that even in winning, he had become a symbol of the town's most shameful elements, and his attempts to reclaim his honour through petty harassment became more frequent. He acquired a job with the government only to lose it within days for laziness, blaming Atticus for his own failures. He targeted Judge Taylor, whose house he tried to break into, and followed Helen Robinson with menacing whispers as she walked to work. These events were like tremors before an earthquake, warnings that the monsters of the mind were taking physical shape in the shadows of the town. Within the Finch household, the dynamics continued to evolve as the children navigated their new understanding of the world's darkness. Atticus remained the calm centre, teaching them that while Bob Ewell was a threat, he was also a man who had had his day in court and lost the only thing he truly cared about, the town's respect. Jem's growing maturity was evident in his protective attitude towards Scout, an echo of the way Atticus protected the vulnerable in the courtroom. They began to see their father not just as a lawyer, but as a man who lived his philosophy every hour of the day, someone who was the same in the house as he was on the street. This consistency was their anchor in a town where people changed their morals as easily as their clothes. The narrative then focuses on the peculiar events leading up to the Halloween pageant of the year 1936. Because the children of the town had caused mischief the previous year, the adults decided to organise a structured celebration at the school. Scout was cast as a ham, a role that required her to wear a cumbersome costume made of chicken wire and brown cloth. On the night of the pageant, as they walked through the pitch-black woods toward the school, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of cosmic indifference. The ordinary sounds of the night, the crickets, the wind in the trees, seemed to take on a predatory quality. Scout's costume, which restricted her vision and movement, became a metaphor for the way prejudice blinds and traps the individual within a rigid social identity. The climax of the story occurs on the walk home from the pageant, a moment where the phantoms of the children's imagination and the monsters of the town's reality finally collide. In the absolute darkness of the woods, they were attacked by Bob Ewell in a final desperate act of cowardice. The violence was swift and chaotic. Jem's arm was snapped, and Scout was nearly crushed within her costume. It was in this moment of peak terror that a mysterious figure intervened, pulling Ewell away and carrying the broken Jem toward the safety of the light. This saviour was none other than Boo Radley, the man who'd been the subject of their childhood games and fears. The trouble of being born into a world of judgment had forced Boo into a life of sigence, yet he emerged to perform an act of radical, selfless kindness. As Scout eventually realised, sitting in the quiet of Jem's room, the real ghost was the one who had been watching over them all along, proving that in the end, the only thing that can truly conquer the dark is a quiet, steady humanity. To grasp the full weight of the aftermath following the struggle in the woods, we must consider the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the Finch house on that night in late October of 1935. The chaos of the attack had been replaced by a tense, hushed urgency as Dr. Reynolds and Sheriff Heck Tate moved through the hallways. Scout, still reeling from the events and the physical confinement of her ham costume, stood in the corner of Jem's room, watching the various adults piecing together the wreckage. The monsters of her childhood, the fears of ghosts and shadows, had been replaced by the very real, very human malice of Bob Ewell. Yet in the midst of this darkness, there was the presence of the stranger who had carried Jem home. This man, pale and thin, with hands that seemed to have never seen the sun, was the living embodiment of the Mockingbird Atticus had described years prior, a creature that exists only to provide beauty or safety, never to harm. The philosophical tension of this section rests on the conversation between Atticus and Heck Tate regarding the death of Bob Ewell. Atticus, ever the man of law and unwavering integrity, initially believes that Jem was the one who killed Ewell in self-defense. He is prepared to take his own son through the legal system, fearing that a cover-up would undermine everything he has taught his children about honesty and the law. He insists that he cannot live with himself or look his children in the eye if he allows a lie to stand. However, the sheriff, a man who understands the nuances of Maycomb justice far better than the idealized version found in law books, realizes the truth. It was Boo Radley who killed Ewell to save the children. Heck Tate's argument is a profound meditation on the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. He points out that dragging Boo Radley into the spotlight, even for a heroic act, would be a sin. Boo is a man of extreme fragility and shyness, a person for whom the public gaze would be as destructive as a physical blow. To bring him to court would be to kill a mockingbird. Tate decides to record the event as Bob Ewell falling on his own knife, effectively burying the truth to protect the innocent. When Atticus asks Scout if she understands this decision, she provides the emotional climax of the story by saying, "Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it?" This moment signifies Scout's transition into moral adulthood. She has learned that true justice sometimes requires the heart to overrule the code. The walk back to the Radley house that night serves as the final quiet coda to Scout's childhood. As she leads Boo Radley by the hand across the street, showing a maternal tenderness that reverses their previous roles of monster and victim, she is physically crossing the final threshold of her innocence. For years, the Radley house had been a source of terror, a place where their imaginations ran wild with stories of blood and shadows. Now it was simply the home of a neighbour who was tired and uncertain. When Boo finally retreats into his house and the door shuts, Scout realises she will never see him again. Yet he has left an indelible mark on her soul. She stands on his porch and, for the first time, truly obeys Atticus's command to walk in another man's skin. From the perspective of the Radley porch, the geography of Maycomb looks entirely different. Scout looks out at the neighbourhood and relives the events of the past 2 years, the gifts in the knothole, the fire at Miss Maudie's, the mad dog and the trial, all through Boo's eyes. She realises that while they were busy playing games about him, he was busy watching over them, perhaps seeing them as his children. This realisation is the ultimate triumph of empathy over prejudice. She understands now that Boo Radley wasn't hiding from the world because of malice. He was a silent witness to a neighbourhood that was both beautiful and broken. The story concludes back at the Finch house, with Scout curling up in Atticus's lap as he reads The Grey Ghost. The choice of the book is no accident. It tells the story of a character who was misunderstood and feared until people finally saw him for who he was. Scout tells her father that he was real nice, to which Atticus replies, "Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them." This final line summarises the entire philosophical journey of the novel. The world of the 1930s was one of rigid boundaries and sharp divisions, but through the eyes of a child we see that the only way to navigate such a world is with a quiet, persistent decency. As Scout falls asleep, the image of Atticus sitting by Jem's bed remains as the final anchor of the narrative. He is the guardian of the truth, the protector of the innocent, and the man who taught his children that even in the face of absolute darkness, one must remain the same in the house as on the street. The mockingbird survives in the spirit of those who choose to do the right thing when no one is watching, and though the innocence of childhood has been lost, a more profound, resilient kind of wisdom has been gained in the red clay of Maycomb. To truly appreciate the internal architecture of To Kill a Mockingbird, we must pivot from the linear events of the plot to an exhaustive analysis of the mockingbird as a multifaceted philosophical symbol. In the year 1935, the world of Maycomb was an ecosystem of rigid biological and social hierarchies, yet the mockingbird stood outside of these classifications. When Atticus first tells his children that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird, he is setting a moral precedent that contradicts the survival of the fist mentality prevalent in the American South. This section explores the layers of that metaphor, tracing it from its literal origins as a bird that makes music for us to enjoy to its manifestation in the lives of Tom Robinson and Boo Radley. The mockingbird is the ultimate representation of non-utility. It does not eat people's gardens or nest in corn cribs. It exists purely for the sake of its own song, and therefore its destruction is an act of pure, unadulterated malice. The tragedy of Tom Robinson is the most visceral example of the metaphor being shattered by the machinery of societal prejudice. Tom's innocence was not merely a lack of guilt regarding the crime he was accused of, it was a fundamental inherent decency that led him to help Mayella Ewell without any expectation of reward. In the eyes of Maycomb, this innocence was his greatest weakness. By feeling pity for a white woman, Tom stepped out of the caste assigned to him by the year of his birth and the colour of his skin. This transgression made him a target for the hunters of Maycomb, those who, like Bob Ewell, could not tolerate a world where a black man possessed a higher moral standing than themselves. When Tom is shot 17 times, it is not just an execution, it is a frantic, overcompensatory attempt by the town to silence a song that made them uncomfortable. Boo Radley represents the other side of the Mockingbird coin, the internal domestic victim of the town's trouble. While Tom was destroyed by the public square, Boo was destroyed by the private house. His song was the small gifts he left in the knothole, and the blanket he placed over Scout's shoulders during the fire. He's a creature of the shadows who has been killed by the rumours and the isolation imposed upon him by his family and the town's collective imagination. However, unlike Tom, Boo is given a final moment of agency. By emerging from his house to save the children, he risks his ultimate sanctuary to preserve the lives of the next generation. The sin of bringing him to trial, as Sheriff Hecate points out, would be the final blow to a bird that has already suffered a broken wing. This section argues that the mockingbird is not just an individual, it is the very concept of the other, the vulnerable person whom society seeks to crush because it cannot understand their purity. Finally, we must look at how the children, Scout and Jem, become mockingbirds in training. Throughout the narrative, they are exposed to the winter of human nature, yet they are shielded by the steady hand of Atticus. Their loss of innocence is not a descent into darkness, but an ascent into a higher, more painful form of clarity. They learn that the world is a place where mockingbirds are constantly under threat, and that the only way to live a life of integrity is to become a protector of those songs. This leads to the realization that Atticus himself is a kind of mockingbird, a man whose only song is the truth, and who is nearly destroyed by the town for refusing to stop singing it. The philosophy of the novel suggests that we are all born as mockingbirds, but the world forces us to either become hunters or to find the courage to keep our song alive in the face of the silence. Let's move into a deep dive exploration of the architecture of empathy as practiced by Atticus Finch. Atticus is often characterized as a paragon of virtue, but to see him only as a hero is to miss the radical, quiet struggle of his daily existence. In the 1930s, his philosophy of climbing into another man's skin and walking around in it was not a feel-good platitude. It was a survival strategy for the soul. This section analyzes the specific instances where Atticus demonstrates this empathy, not only toward the victims like Tom Robinson, but more importantly, toward the victimizers like Mrs. DuBose and Bob Ewell. Atticus recognizes that the trouble in Maycomb is a cycle of generational trauma and ignorance. He understands that Mrs. DuBose's bitterness is a byproduct of her agonizing battle with addiction, and he realizes that Bob Ewell's malice stems from a life of crushing poverty and social rejection. This radical empathy is the most difficult lesson for the children to learn. It is easy to feel for Tom Robinson, but it is nearly impossible for Scout and Jem to feel for the man who spat in their father's face. Yet Atticus insists on it. He tells Jem that if he can stand in Bob Ewell's shoes for just a minute, he will see a man who has had the last scrap of his dignity stripped away in his courtroom. By refusing to retaliate, Atticus is attempting to break the cycle of violence that defines the town. He is teaching his children that the only way to truly win against a monster is to refuse to become one yourself. This is the courage of the middle-aged man, the ability to endure humiliation for the sake of a higher principle. We also examine the role of Calpurnia as the bridge of empathy between the white and black worlds of Maycomb. Calpurnia is the one who introduces the children to a reality that exists outside the Finch bubble. When she takes them to First Purchase African Emmy Church, she is showing them that empathy is not just a mental exercise, it is a physical and social experience. Scout realizes that Calpurnia has a double life, a way of speaking and being that shifts depending on her surroundings. This discovery is a seismic shift in Scout's understanding of identity. She begins to see that skin is not just a biological fact, it is a social costume that people are forced to wear. Calpurnia's ability to navigate both worlds with dignity is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in a segregated society. The section concludes by looking at the empathy of the ending. When Scout stands on the Radley porch in the final pages of the book, she is not just performing a task, she is achieving a cosmic perspective. She looks at the town of Maycomb not as a collection of neighbours, but as a living, breathing history. She sees the mockingbirds and the hunters as part of a single tragic story. This is the moment where Atticus's teachings finally take root. Scout realizes that empathy is the only cure for the trouble of being born into a world of prejudice. It is the ability to see the phantom as a neighbour and the enemy as a brother. This realization is the ultimate grey ghost of the novel, the truth that is right in front of us, yet so hard to see until we are willing to change our vantage point. To reach the final summit of our exploration into the moral architecture of Maycomb, we must analyse the enduring legacy of the quiet hero. As we move past the year 1935 and look toward the broader horizon of human history, we see that the character of Atticus Finch has become more than a literary figure. He has become a psychological archetype for the just man in an unjust world. This final section investigates the cost of such a position. Atticus is not a man who wins, he is a man who loses with such profound dignity that he exposes the hollow nature of his opponent's victory. The trouble of being born into a world of fixed prejudices is that the truth often acts as a mirror that people are terrified to look into. Atticus's legacy is not found in the legal acquittal of Tom Robinson, which was an impossibility, but in the 2 hours the jury spent deliberating. Those 2 hours represented a microscopic crack in the foundation of the Old South, a sign that the Mockingbird's song had, for a brief moment, been heard over the roar of the crowd. The final philosophical realization of the narrative is the concept of the moral universe's long arc. Scout and Jem come to understand that while they cannot change the town of Maycomb overnight, they can change the way they inhabit it. This is the ultimate undoing of the disaster of their environment. By the end of the story, Scout has learned that most people are real nice when you finally see them, which is not a statement of naive optimism, but one of radical maturity. It suggests that the ghosts and monsters we fear, whether they are named Boo Radley or simply the other, are often just projections of our own internal shadows. To see someone is to strip away the social costumes of 1936 and recognise the shared biological and spiritual vulnerability that connects us all. This is the only true way to protect the mockingbirds of the world, to refuse to participate in the collective hallucination of difference. We conclude by reflecting on the image of Atticus sitting by his son's bed in the quiet of the night. He is a man who has seen the worst of his community, the racism, the violence, the cowardice of Bob Ewell, yet he remains the same in the dark as he is in the light. This consistency is the ultimate form of resistance. The novel suggests that while we cannot prevent the sin of killing a mockingbird, we can choose to be the ones who stay awake to watch over the survivors. As Scout drifts into a sleep that marks the definitive end of her childhood, she is anchored by the presence of a father who taught her that the trouble of being born is best met with a quiet, persistent and immovable decency. The story of Maycomb ends, but the challenge it presents to the reader remains eternal. To walk in the skin of the stranger until the stranger is no longer a phantom but a friend.